Good afternoon. We'll be starting up in just a couple of minutes. Continue to enjoy your food. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us. It's a beautiful day, and delighted to welcome you here to Stetson University College of Law. I'm Professor Roy Gardner. I'm the director of the Institute for Biodiversity Law and Policy, and so this will be our first Edward and Bonnie Foreman Biodiversity Lecture of the spring semester. And I'd like to thank Bonnie Foreman again for sponsoring this. Bonnie, as you know, is a member of the Board of Overseers and also the Board of Trustees of the university. She's just a great friend and supporter of Stetson and the environmental programs here, so I do want to take a moment to thank her for her friendship and support. I'd also like to thank the students of the Environmental Law Society who have helped set this up and make sure that we have the food here. So thank you to the students as well. And then what I'd like to do is call up Professor Lance Long to introduce our speaker, because Professor Long has actually collaborated with Andrew Hayslip, and so I thought it was appropriate for him to do the introduction. Please welcome Professor Lance Long.
Thanks, everyone. I'm glad we have a good crowd here today. Andrew, or Andy as I call him, we actually met shortly after he arrived here in the Tampa Bay area. He is the founder actually of Tampa Bay Waterkeepers. Now, some of you may be unfamiliar with what this whole Waterkeeper thing means. Basically, there's a whole group of keepers for all things aquatic. It started up in, I think, Hudson River or something with the Riverkeepers, the Hudson Riverkeepers or whatever, and then some people had, well, we can do the Long Island Sound and the Bay and all these water-keeping type sounding groups started forming, and someone had the great idea, well, let's make an alliance, and we'll put all our powers together and become the greatest force for preserving water in the United States. And actually, that's kind of what happens. Actually, I think the Waterkeeper Alliance is one of the fastest, if not the fastest growing environmental group that protects, as its focus, the waters of the United States, maybe even expanded beyond the waters of the United States. So Andy's been here since fall of 2017, and we met because we both are the Tampa Bay Waterkeepers, Surf Rider, and other groups that we're all a part of, actually formed a coalition here in St. Petersburg called Rise Above Plastics. And it's one of the moving forces behind St. Petersburg's new ordinance against plastic straws and some polystyrene. And in fact, we just met and we realized we have to get together and talk about some things in Gulfport here after, or we can do it actually for Saturday. We realized we both have a big event down in Williams Park, Localtopia. You probably all know about it, and we'll be there for sure. Andy will be tabling there at Tampa Bay Waterkeepers. I'll be tabling with Surf Rider. So anyway, Andy actually has done amazing things in before coming here. He was up in North Carolina with a group up there preserving waters. It was actually the Watauga Riverkeeper, right? Watauga Riverkeeper up in North Carolina. He actually has his bachelor's in geography and urban planning from Florida State, those of you Noel fans there. And he has his master's degree in environmental science and policy from USF, right down here, down the street. It's kind of the degree I'm encouraging my son to go after. So anyway, and so he studied, and he's going to talk more about this, so I'm not going to talk too much about it, but he studied a lot about the interface between urban environment and spatial planning and its effect on waters, and that's part of what we'll be talking about today. But he's really a knowledgeable person and just a wonderful human being altogether. So join me in welcoming Andy Hayslip here to Stetson.
Oh, shucks. Thank y'all so much for having me. It's truly, I'm humbled and grateful to be here. When I looked at the list of folks that have spoken before me as part of this lecture series, many of them are heroes to me. So to be included in this series it's an honor, and so I'm truly humbled and grateful to be here. So I will talk a little bit about Waterkeeper Alliance in general, and the kind of goal is to kind of look at what that model is that Waterkeeper Alliance takes to each watershed worldwide. We're in over 40 countries or so now at this point, and where we combine science, policy advocacy, grassroots community engagement, and litigation when necessary to protect our right to clean water. So in Tampa Bay, our goal is to protect and improve the Tampa Bay watershed. And again, by combining sound science, policy advocacy, engagement, and education. We are a 501c3 nonprofit, though we're a member of Waterkeeper Alliance. We're our own standalone organization. Our headquarters are right in downtown St. Pete. Our watershed covers all the entire Tampa Bay watershed. I have a map of that I'll go into in just a moment. But about the crux of what we do is to uphold the Clean Water Act, enforce it, and ensure that we get to where the authors wanted to go with it. So in 1972, we had this sweeping act with the boldest of missions to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. I believe the first date that was set to achieve this mission was like 1985 or so. Obviously, we're not there yet. We have a long way to go, even in the face of repeated attempts to roll back the requirements of the Clean Water Act. So we're fighting to keep it in place at the same time as we're fighting to implement it. A little bit about Waterkeeper Alliance in general. It was founded, as Lance mentioned, it has its roots from just grassroots commercial and recreational fishers in the Hudson River Valley in New York, whose livelihoods are being taken away by industrial pollution. And so they started suing folks, said, hey, this is not right. You're taking away my livelihood, my ability to provide for my family, to provide food for our community, for private gain. This is wholly not acceptable. We're going to start banding together and suing folks until something starts to change. And then we had the Clean Water Act, and we had a continuously growing grassroots movement that did indeed culminate under the Waterkeeper Alliance, which was founded in its current form and still helmed by Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who is in that top right picture. It was actually moments after he asked me to hop the fence with him at Niagara Falls, and I was like, when Bobby Kennedy asks you to commit an act of civil disobedience, you go for it. So this is just about Waterkeeper in general and the impact that it's had and is continuing to have worldwide. Almost 2.7 million square miles of watersheds that provide drinking water and water access to 690 million people. It is the fastest growing group dedicated solely to clean water in the world. There are 340 Waterkeeper organizations and affiliates in 44 countries now at this point. Collectively over 1,000 staff, 471,000 volunteers with a collective budget of approximately $73 million. So a little bit about who we are and who I am and my background. I think it's important because as the founder and the executive director, where I come from and what I think is important adds a lens through which I view what issues we need to focus on, what issues I think are important, what the solutions are, and it kind of sets up a theoretical framework for what we do at Tampa Bay Waterkeeper. This is myself in the middle. I thought you might think there was an imposter. I did shave, so I know all the pictures are in beer. Like, who's this clean-shaven dude? But this is from the left. That's our board member Mike Drexler, PhD in fisheries science from USF College of Marine Science. He's with the Ocean Conservancy now. Ren LaForme with the Poynter Institute, communications and Google Fellow at the Poynter Institute. And myself, Andrew Palumbo, homebrewer extraordinaire, CPA. Lily Conrad, who's the communications director for Florida Hospital Group, and Phil Price, the CFO for Smith & Associates. All passionate clean water advocates, they're a working board. We're a small group. We just, again, founded in fall of 2017, so we're small but scrappy bunch. But about myself, so I did my undergrad at Florida State, where academically, I still consider myself an environmental geographer. And that is where I look at human systems and the way we plan and manage our cities and how that intersects with our natural systems and our environment, and particularly as it affects water. My master's thesis is on the Apalachicola, Chattahoochee, Flint River basin and the water wars with which you might be familiar between Georgia, Florida, and Alabama. So it's, again, looking at how humans manage water in our cities and in our regions, and how that affects our in-stream residents, and our natural habitat, and how those two things kind of play together. And I think that approach is particularly important for the Tampa Bay watershed, which is one of the more urbanized estuaries in the country. So that background of, I was a city planner for the city of Clearwater for a little while. I was a city planner for the city of Bradenton, and did some planning work on the private sector as well, and kind of taking that background paired with my work that I did at the Florida Fish and Wildlife Research Institute, where I worked for several years, and my just lifelong passion for clean water and just getting out and enjoying our waterways seem to have converged into what this is and what I'm doing today in Tampa Bay Waterkeeper. So we do cover, our boundary is we're watershed thinkers. As soon as I got the license from Waterkeeper Alliance International, I de-residented myself, that's not a word, but from St. Petersburg, and the whole St. Pete versus Tampa thing just became moot to me because I just started thinking on a watershed scale. And I continue to think that way. I look at problems this way along hydrologic boundaries, not political boundaries. As we know, water doesn't care about political boundaries. But the area in yellow is where we have, as a Waterkeeper organization, exclusive jurisdiction. We butt up against our fellow Waterkeeper organization to the south, Suncoast Waterkeeper, based in Sarasota. So that's that line there. But our watershed, it's not just Tampa Bay, it's our Gulf Coast beaches. It includes the Hillsborough River, the Alafaya River, the Little Manatee River. The Manatee is under the jurisdiction of the Suncoast Waterkeeper, but it's in our quote-unquote sphere of influence, so we work very closely on issues that are down there. And so again, kind of just our approach, we exist to protect our natural heritage. Everything we do as an advocacy organization, and coming from my background, and doing this work in this region that has such a storied institutional involvement in protecting clean water in Tampa Bay, it has to be couched in sound science. And I'll get more into this a little bit later, but we, as when we launched, there was some institutional pushback of, who's this organization coming in here trying to monitor water quality? The government's already doing that. What's going on here? So I'll get more into that. It's kind of interesting a little bit later, but I think collaboration between local governments and ourselves is very important, while also at the same time recognizing our duty as a Waterkeeper organization to hold all polluters accountable, including local governments and regional governments, as well as industry. And just in short, we stand up for the public's right to clean, fishable, swimmable, and drinkable water in Tampa Bay. It goes back to that goals of the Clean Water Act, right? This is from a March trip to DC, lobbying folks on Capitol Hill about the importance of funding the Tampa Bay Estuary Program and funding NOAA, National Marine Fisheries Service, who manage our fisheries and things like that. So I'll just run over a little bit of our core issues that we've kind of identified in the Tampa Bay Watershed through just our work with the Tampa Bay Estuary Program, through going through their fantastic charting the course document that they've maintained over the years, and then through our own understanding of our issues. We have stormwater pollution. It's our biggest polluter in the Tampa Bay watershed. It's the vehicle for our biggest pollutant in the Tampa Bay watershed, which is nitrogen and phosphorus, so nutrient pollution. Wastewater pollution, which also contributes to nutrient pollution. We have a historic underinvestment in wastewater infrastructure in the Tampa Bay watershed. I'm sure you all were here in 2015, 2016. I was riverkeeping up in the mountains of western North Carolina when this was happening, and it was just eating up in my soul to see over 200 million gallons of raw and partially treated sewage dumped into Tampa Bay, and an additional $800 million illegally discharged into deep water injection wells here in St. Pete and Gulfport. I will say that lawsuit, that resulted in a Clean Water Act lawsuit filed by Suncoast Waterkeeper and two other organizations, and that was settled about a month and a half ago. That was a two-year battle, but it resulted in a $326 million supercharged consent order, what they're calling it, wherein there is federal court oversight on the requirements of that FDEP consent order. As you may or may not know, FDEP has historically under-enforced certain things, and so our role as a watchdog organization is to make sure that things are enforced as they should be. So coastal resilience and climate adaptation planning. I'll go into a little bit more detail about this. We are in one of the top 10 most at-risk regions in the entire world when it comes to sea level rise and climate change. And I touched on this a moment ago, but enforcement, that's kind of an area where Waterkeeper organizations really set themselves apart from other environmental groups where we're out on our water. We literally patrol our waterways. We respond to citizen reports of pollution. We develop monitoring programs that are both for the purposes of trend tracking and informing the public, but we also develop monitoring programs that are designed to monitor NPDES permits, or National Pollution Discharge Elimination System permits, which are essentially permits to pollute at various facilities. We monitor these permits and are continuously developing a protocol to ensure that the permitted discharge is being met. So we're going out and taking more samples and making sure that what they say is what folks say is happening is actually happening. So, stormwater pollution, again, I mentioned it's the largest polluter of the Tampa Bay watershed, and this is important because this is going to kind of lead into our biggest campaign yet, and we're just now kicking it off this year, and that is to reel in stormwater pollution in Tampa Bay. It leads to an increase in nitrogen, which of course leads to harmful algal blooms like red tide and reduced oxygen, fish kills, impacts to seagrass and other essential fish habitat. And it's a huge hit to the economy. We're coming off of the fourth longest red tide event on record, I believe 16 months, and people lost jobs. Businesses were shuttered, especially in the Caloosahatchee estuary when it was a double storm of cyanobacteria and red tide off the coast. Those two things feeding, of course, one another, and it's water has become, thankfully and appropriately, we're a nonpartisan organization. Water is now increasingly being recognized as a bipartisan issue here in the state of Florida, and our goal is to continue to drive that home. It's also the major vehicle for marine debris and plastic pollution too. So when we're dealing with plastic pollution, our mission is to cut it off at the source, and that's why we've been fighting so hard for bans for removing preemptions at the state level so that we can regulate plastics in our own watershed. But we operate under NOAA's Honolulu protocol when it comes to dealing with marine debris. So that includes stopping it at its source through regulatory policy advocacy, cleaning it up when it's in our waterways, and just kind of that whole cycle. It's going to be a long battle, but the plastics problem is global and not going anywhere, and quite scary and keeps me up at night. Sewage pollution, it's plagued Tampa Bay for decades. It's not just the city of St. Pete, it's not just the city of Gulfport, it's the entire state of Florida, it's the entire nation. Many older urbanized areas have historically underinvested in wastewater infrastructure, and it's having a terrible impact on our local waterways. It's not a sexy thing to put money into, and folks have buried their head in the sands for decades, and it's resulted in terrible wastewater spills that have affected our health, our economy, and our environment, and that's not acceptable. And so our goal is to continue to push for adequate funding for wastewater infrastructure, to get folks to go in and recognize the connection between this and our local waterways and affect positive change. It's also a contributor of nitrogen and nutrient pollution, which also, of course, contributes to harmful algal blooms and impacts to our to seagrass and other essential fish habitat. It also really, beyond that, and this bottom point kind of clarifies that it's created a sort of issue where folks have, because it was so publicized, it was the hot topic of the last mayoral battle for the city of St. Petersburg. Got a lot of folks talking about sewage pollution, and it's created this distrust with our ability to recreate in our local waterways, which is both a shame because A, we have a right to do so without concern for our health. B, if folks aren't recreating our local waterways, there's a possibility that spark of inspiration that makes people fall in love with our water and with what makes Tampa Bay so special, that might not happen if they're concerned about, oh, this is where all the sewage goes, and let's avoid this area. I'll talk more about that in a little bit. So coastal management and resiliency, we are extremely vulnerable in Tampa Bay. One of the 10 one of the 10 coastal metropolitan areas most vulnerable to flooding and climate change and sea level rise in the world. We're already seeing it, and recent trends have kind of notched that expected rise upward. We have some good things happening. There's the Tampa Bay Regional Resiliency Coalition that has come into being at the Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council level, covering those counties along the Sun Coast and throughout Tampa Bay. They're going to take that model that has been so successful in Southeast Florida with the Southeast Florida Climate Compact and apply that here. And I'm hopeful, we've been involved in that and we'll continue to be involved in that, and I'm hopeful that's going to move the notch. Coming from the local government level, working in local government, I know that there are opportunities within our local comprehensive plans at the county level. All coastal counties are required to have a coastal management element. There are opportunities to ratchet up requirements in that and really improve those things. So that's another area that we're going to be continuously focused on. just love to throw this in. Just yes, we are seeing sea level rise. This is from the St. Pete gauge, NOAA's relative sea level rise map. Showing that we're looking at by 2100 from 1 to 7 feet, and again, this is starting to trend upwards. The last study I saw was from last year, and it's happening. It's going to continue to happen. We've got to do a better job planning for it now. So, some other campaigns. Professor Long mentioned the Rise Above Plastics campaign. So, plastic pollution is of course, it's a global problem, but it's something that we have to start in our own watershed, in our own communities doing. In March, I was in D.C. and met with then Senator Bill Nelson's staff, and we were talking about plastic pollution, and they just kind of drove home the message that yes, it's gotta start, in the grand old United States. It's got to start in your local watersheds, create the grassroots momentum that builds upwards, so we can affect change at the national level. But until then, it's up to us, it's up to our community, it's up to the city of Gulfport right here to start changing, to start implementing incremental improvements in policies that not only send a ripple throughout the state and throughout the national government, but truly create a positive change here locally. It doesn't do nothing here. It keeps these things out of our waterways, which is extremely important, but it does send a message too. So it's kind of a dual front there. And the plastics pollution is so huge and ubiquitous that a 2015 study from the University of Georgia found that 8 million metric tons of plastic pollution enter our waterways every year globally. And that compounds year after year, because as we know, plastic doesn't break down. It photodegrades over 500 years or so into microplastics. So this number is compounded year after year, 8 million metric tons. And to put that number in some kind of context, that's the equivalent of 5 plastic Publix bags full of plastic for every foot of coastline in the world every year that enter our waterways. So yes, massive global problem, but it's something that we have to start with right here in our own watershed. Another ongoing campaign for us that we don't see stopping anytime soon is offshore drilling. When I was with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Research Institute, I was working at the Center for Spatial Analysis, and I was a direct responder to Deepwater Horizon. I spent those 3 months, call it the lost summer. I was going into work. Dr. Tuan Hu at the College of Marine Science was pulling down the raw satellite imagery of the surface oiling around 2:30 a.m. It was my job. He passed that off to me around 4:30 a.m., and that's when I came in and converted that into kind of human readable data, a shapefile, and made maps that sat on 5 governors' desks by the 0630 briefing every morning for 3 months. I did this with my colleagues at FWRI, and that really galvanized, as if I didn't care enough before, but just seeing that really kind of galvanized the advocate in me on offshore drilling, absolutely holding the line on that on the moratorium in the Eastern Gulf, but beyond that, we need to stop drilling in the Gulf, period, because as this map showed, I created this map towards the end of the spill event. This is the total footprint of the Deepwater Horizon spill of surface oiling. So, and what we have learned since is that we had fish that were caught in Tampa Bay that were traced back to oiling from MC-252 from the Deepwater Horizon incident. We had oiling 40 miles from the mouth of Tampa Bay from Deepwater Horizon. So it's not just an issue for the Western Gulf. If it's a Gulf-wide issue, it's a Tampa Bay watershed issue. So we're going to be continuously fighting this at every opportunity we get. And so I kind of want to spend a little more time on this because this has been going to be what we've been focusing most of our work on, and what we will be focusing a lot of our work in 2019 and beyond on. And that's our right to swimmable water. So under the Clean Water Act, we have a right to fishable, swimmable, and drinkable water. And in Tampa Bay, it seems to be the greatest disconnect is our ability to safely recreate in our own watershed. I asked some folks before I started this, I was like, would you just, in Shore Acres, I was walking my dog, and I was like, did you just hop off your dock and go swimming in your canal ever? And they looked at me like I was nuts. I'm like, no, I don't swim there, I go to the beach. Fair enough, the beach is great, but you know, why don't you swim there? Like, well, it's polluted, it's got sewage in it, so I'll get sick. They're not necessarily wrong, but they're not, you know, doesn't change the fact that they have a right under the Clean Water Act, and it's a basic human right, to be able to recreate anywhere in the Tampa Bay watershed without concern for their health. The Tampa Bay watershed, including Tampa Bay itself, the Hillsborough River, the Alafai River, the Little Manatee River, Boca Ciega Bay, you name it, it has a Class 2 or Class 3 designation by the EPA, which assigns designated uses to our watershed. And one of those designated uses is recreation, and that includes swimming and recreational contact. So we have a right to be able to swim without concern for our own health. So our goal is to get us there. I reached out to folks with Pinellas County, the Estuary Program, Hillsborough County, City of Tampa, City of St. Pete, most municipalities, to really compile a list of everything that was being monitored for recreational water quality. And the indicator we use for recreational water quality is Enterococcus, which is a fecal indicator bacteria. And the state of Florida, the Department of Health, has set a pretty conservative threshold for where what the beach action value is. So if a sample comes back over 70 CFU per 100 milliliters of water, so colony forming units per sample of water, if it's above that, they mark a site red, they said don't swim there. If it's below that, it's green, it's good. And that's what we use when we sample water quality and evaluate those results and report them out to the public. I have some maps of our results too, but we developed this watershed-wide water quality sampling program, and it's not only going to allow us to pinpoint sources of pollution, problem areas that we need to drive, to kind of drill in on, using things like microbial source tracking to make sure that we're looking at the right culprit, looking at sub-basins and doing dye tests to figure out where there might be leaky wastewater infrastructure, and essentially finding the source of the problem and fixing it. When I first reached out to all these local governments and mentioned that we were going to be doing this work, that we were going to be collecting water quality data every week, all year long, and reporting it out to the public in near real time, I got an email, and I knew I was on the right track for our first big program when I got an email from someone, to remain nameless, that they said, "You're making a lot of people nervous with this." And I was denied some grant funds for this program. And I said, okay, this is a good program to do. We do 10 sites. We started with 10. Again, we're monitoring for Enterococcus. Talking about science-based, because we're going to be presenting water quality data to the public, I wanted it to be just as airtight as possible. So we spent several months developing our standard operating procedures, developing a quality assurance plan in coordination with other Waterkeeper organizations, in close coordination with FDEP. They reviewed our quality assurance plan. Of course, they can't sign off on it, but they reviewed it, and our samples are analyzed by a lab that's certified under the NELAP accreditation agency. So the data that we produce is of a quality, it's of a known quality that can be used by the state and federal government for actions, including informing impaired waterways decisions. And importantly enough, that last point I mentioned about that disconnect about people's ability to recreate in their own watersheds and not knowing whether or not it's safe, we want to present that to the public and let them know when it is safe, because it's important to get folks out in the water, because that engenders a spirit of conservation when they see, wow, this is beautiful, this is worth protecting. So it's kind of a double-edged sword there too. These are our first 10 sites. We plan to expand from here, but we monitor each of these sites weekly and all year long. We have Gulfport Beach, Bayboro Harbor at USF St. Pete, North Shore Beach, right in downtown St. Pete, Jungle Prada Park over in Boca Ciega Bay, Wheaton Island, South Gandy, right near the Urban Kai put in and the Getaway, Veterans Memorial Park up in downtown Safety Harbor. We have 2 sites on the Hillsborough River, one at Rivercrest Park in Seminole Heights, Julian B. Lane Riverfront Park at that new park in downtown Tampa, and then another one down in South Hillsborough County at Cockroach Bay. And I believe next is a series of maps that show our results for the past several weeks. So I can kind of run through these pretty quickly. This is just our last set of results. We had one site test below that 70 CFU per 100 milliliter, that beach action value developed by the Department of Health, and that was at Wheaton Island. Wheaton Island's usually pretty good. Mangroves are fantastic. But the staggering part about this, and it's not depicted here, but I have the data, is if it's above 70, we mark it red. But how do you, we can use things in GIS like graduated symbols, and we'll get to that at this point, but this is just less than a week ago. A couple of these results were so astronomically high that, for example, I believe the Upper Hillsborough site, the result was around 8,800. When 71 is considered unsafe. 5,000 or so for the Lower Hillsborough site. The USF Bayboro site was, I think, around 5,000, a few thousand CFUs for the downtown St. Pete site, but it was just a really bad week for water quality. It was a very windy week. Winds can kick up sediments. Enterococcus can live in sediments, so we understand that there are some conditions there, but going back, better week. But you'll see trends. The Hillsborough River sites have never tested below the state's threshold for what's considered safe for recreational water quality. Hillsborough, the Safety Harbor site, has tested well, I think once or twice since we started this last October. I remember I was really excited about this week. It was right before Thanksgiving, and it was really beautiful weather. And I was like, get out there and enjoy the waterways, folks. It was one of our best weeks. The week before, not so great. But all that data is available through a free app called Swim Guide that is a partner organization of Waterkeeper Alliance. You can download it on your phone, and it's updated every single Friday. We push these results out through our social media channels, through our website, through optional text alerts. Our goal is to just educate the public as best as possible, and it's a good segue into the fact that we weave education and outreach and celebration of our waterways through everything we do. Just to quote Ed Abbey, it's not enough to fight for the land or the water, it's even more important to enjoy it. And a little bit of our monitoring and patrol program. It sounds kind of like I'm a wannabe water cop when I talk about like I'm out patrolling the waterways, and that's kind of true, but it's really important. Chattahoochee Riverkeeper over Christmas break they got a tip, and then they went out on a patrol and found a multi-million gallon raw sewage spill on a tributary to the Chattahoochee River because someone saw it, someone thought to report it to Chattahoochee Riverkeeper, and they got out there and took samples, video documentation, photo documentation. It truly does make a difference. So, if you're out in the waterways and you see something that you think is wrong and shouldn't be there, or you see a fish kill, there are appropriate fish kill hotlines through FWC and so forth, but if you don't know where to go or who to call, reach out to us. We will follow up on it. It's our job to get out there, to document it, and to ensure that the appropriate regulatory agencies are contacted, that they're involved, and that they're fixing the problem. Before I look forward to future programs, a little bit more about our Swimmable Waters campaign. So this past week was so bad, it got a lot of responses from folks from us. We were the primary beneficiary and helping out with a big swim event on the Hillsborough River. The organizers that do Shark Fest swim, including they do the Alcatraz swim, they do like the Staten Island Statue of Liberty swim, they do these big open water swims. They reached out to us and said, hey, can you provide some volunteers? We'd love to, work with you and do a great urban Hillsborough River swim event. I said, that sounds fantastic. That was back in September. I just had the phone conversation with the organizer yesterday that, look, we've been monitoring water quality upstream and downstream of the proposed route every single week since October, and it has been very bad every single week. They canceled the event for this year, and we're looking to use that as a kind of a galvanizing force to say, okay, let's try again next year, and next year we're going to work with the city of Tampa, we're going to work with Hillsborough County, we're going to work with local governments to try and fix this problem, at least make some headway so that one day we'll be able to uphold our right to clean water under the Clean Water Act, and we'll have swimmable water in Tampa Bay. In the meantime, they're looking at other routes, but swimmable water and its intersection with stormwater pollution is huge for another reason too. It captures, if we can make sure our waters are swimmable and ratchet down stormwater best management practices at the local government level throughout the Tampa Bay watershed, we can also ratchet down simultaneously our major source of nutrient pollution and our major vehicle for emerging contaminants like PFAS, PFOA, and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, PAHs, that use stormwater as their major vehicle for entry into Tampa Bay too. So it's a way to engage the community, but also it knocks out a lot of these other huge issues at the same time. But speaking of emerging contaminants, I'm not sure if y'all heard the news, but the EPA, a few Waterkeeper organizations this week just filed suit against the EPA for refusing to regulate PFAS and PFOA. These are two of emerging contaminants of most concern. They've been used in 3M was a major producer of these contaminants. They've been used in things like Teflon and industrial manufacturing processes for several years. They were phased out and completely banned back in 2015, but they're highly persistent in the environment, and their persistence in our drinking water systems and our fish tissues is just really starting to come into the light. And so we are going to be sampling for that later this year, both in our drinking water supplies and coordinating with Tampa Bay Water and other local governments to do that sort of work, but also in fish tissues. One of the things, I'm out in the water every single week sampling water quality, and I'll see somebody like, hey, is this fish, is it safe to eat? And I was like, probably. I don't quite know. It's a tricky question to answer. We have, with fish consumption advisories at the statewide level, it's this pass off. So FWC does the sampling. They pass off their data and results to DEP, who then passes off their analysis to the Department of Health, who ultimately issues that fish consumption advisory. When you have funds that don't go so far, when you have political wills that might affect things, you have areas and watersheds that just don't get the testing that we need. The Tampa Bay watershed has not been tested for fish tissues with regards to emerging contaminants. A couple other ones throughout Florida have, but Tampa Bay has not. So I was speaking with some former colleagues at FWC, and they're like, yeah, this is great. We should totally do this. So we are partnering with them. We're actually partners with Eckerd and USF, College of Marine Science, on a National Science Foundation grant to test for fish tissue samples throughout Tampa Bay, so we can have a better, clearer understanding of what's in the fish that we're catching. And we're looking at those inshore fish that are not regulated commercially, so snook and redfish and trout and things like that. Things that folks, this is a social justice issue too, it's an environmental justice issue, because you have folks that are relegated to shoreline fishing to feed their families, to provide a source of protein and food for their families that rely on this, and they're not necessarily, they're not informed of exactly what's in the fish that they eat, and B, we have a right to fishable water and to be able to enjoy that resource. And then finally, water quantity and conservation. This is just a huge passion of mine. This has been in the news lately about using treating wastewater and directing it into and injecting it into our aquifer so that we can continue to withdraw from the aquifer. There is a lot, this is a controversial topic, it's ongoing discussion. We are all for the appropriate treatment of wastewater as a way to conserve water, but not as a blank check for unchecked consumption and growth in the development communities as South Hillsborough continues to sprawl, as Pasco continues to sprawl. So, from our standpoint, that there's a proper way to do things, and that starts with conservation and efficiency, and then you move on to hard path solutions like this. So, water quantity and conservation, and ensuring that, yes, just because we're in a very water-rich region, we don't think about this very often, but we should be, and we should be looking more closely at water conservation projects. So we'll be involved with Tampa Bay Water on some projects later this year on that. And I'd love to close with two quotes from conservation biologist Dr. Folkerts. He passed away in 2007. He was a conservation biologist at Auburn. And coming from a science background and now wearing my hardcore advocacy hat and saying, hey, we need to change this policy, we need to do this, we need to affect positive change. There are some in the research community that see this as muddying the waters, and there's a perception issue where we need to stay in our lane of doing this, and then these folks over here can do this. I don't agree with that, and neither did Dr. Folkerts. He says, there are biologists who profess to believe that a dispassionate and detached view of nature is necessary to perform unbiased scientific work. They're wrong. Those who are most aware of the declining health of natural systems must be the ones to sound the alarm. They must be willing to take a stand. So this underlies our Waterkeeper kind of approach to issues. It's science-based, but we will take a stand when we see an issue. We hold polluters accountable through sound science, policy advocacy, and if it comes to it, litigation. And when I got that email that said, hey, you're making a lot of people nervous, that's why this put a smile on my face. So, any questions?
Thanks so much, Andy. I mean, it's really quite impressive what the organization has been doing in such a short period of time, and I mean, it's fascinating to me to see what's going on locally here, because we do work nationally or internationally, but we need to focus at home as well. Let me open it up for questions, Jen.
Sorry. Hi, Andy. So we were just discussing that we know that you take samples. We were wondering at what levels do you guys take samples at your 10 sites?
At what levels in the
Yeah,
water
so
column?
like obviously the surface, and when you get a call, you'll go out to that area, but just like what different levels are you
So
taking?
as indicated by our SOPs and our mid column depth, we try and stay in the 12 to 24 inch range. If we can hit it right in the middle of the column, then great. But it's always kind of a trade-off between safe and accessible access to a sample site. And what we use an intermediary device to sample water, so a big giant extendable scoop, so we can get out there, keep that turned down, snag a sample in the middle of the water column, and then pull that out, so we're not capturing that layer of scum that lies on the surface.
Yeah, hey, great presentation. I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about specifically what can be done with stormwater, because stormwater seems like such a key piece of the whole thing. Like, what are the best technical things? How should be treated? That kind of thing.
Thank you so much for asking me about stormwater. You just asked like the biggest stormwater nerd in the world. So I was with the city of Clearwater when the Pinellas County rewrote its stormwater manual back in 2015, and so I got a chance to work with them on looking at opportunities to ratchet up, and it's always like this push and pull between the development community and the environmental community. That's part of our job this first quarter of this year, is to comb through our local codes at multiple municipalities and cities and counties, and find opportunities to where we can ratchet it up. For example, if a redevelopment of a particular parcel says that you need to address stormwater BMPs if you redevelop more than 60%, maybe that should be lower. Maybe if you are doing this sort of action on a property, maybe you need to address stormwater at this point. Maybe on the incentive side, which is more salient, it appeases the developers a little bit more, maybe you offer better incentives to do things like green infrastructure, permeable pavements, green roofs, bioswales, things like that. So you have kind of a carrot and a stick approach that can be integrated through the land use code and the comprehensive plan.
Thank you, Andrew. You talked about stormwater, but sewage water and stormwater are both collected and distributed by government institutions pretty much. Do you get resistance from government institutions about solving this problem, since we're talking about an issue that, in effect, they're a partner in? And what solutions do you have?
So, my approach, just from a personal level, is always going to be starting out as collaboratively as possible. I think, we all recognize the value of clean water. We all want clean water. But when the willingness of government to make investments, often quite serious financial investments into wastewater infrastructure, that goes unseen until there's what happened in 2015, 2016. Luckily here in Tampa Bay, it's at the kind of the surface of public consciousness, so it's easier to make that point and galvanize grassroots support for those investments. But water bills go up, and that upsets folks, and all things that we'll have to navigate for sure. But ultimately, and as we saw from the 2015, 2016 wet weather events, it resulted in a lawsuit, under the Clean Water Act. So that's an ultimate option, but start collaboratively and work together and try and get things budgeted and get priorities adjusted a little bit. And if all else fails, if we show through science-based data, through microbial source tracking, that inadequate stormwater and wastewater infrastructure is taking away our right to swim and recreate safely in the Tampa Bay watershed, it's a Clean Water Act lawsuit.
Thank you so much for being here, sir. Quick question about the state level regulations. Do you find that Florida is moving in a direction, at least in Tallahassee, that more favors the work that you're doing, or do you find pushback from them? And do you see your organization taking a bigger role in the policy that's shaped in Tallahassee in the future? Or do you think that you're already doing a lot of work in that stage of the process? Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I'll start with the elephant in the room about our incoming governors and the $2.5 billion investment and the announcement of the chief science officer, the announcement of Office of Resilience. These are all, I sit here a bit dumbfounded and cautiously optimistic that this is some of the most sweeping proposed changes that we've seen for statewide water policy in several years. So that all looks good, and I think we're all just kind of waiting to see if things continue to follow through on that. But it looks great. I think again, Cynthia Barnett, who is a hero of mine, she's a writer in Gainesville. She just put a piece out yesterday in the Atlantic. I'd encourage everybody to go read it, but it's about how water has increasingly become a bipartisan, unifying issue. And I grew up in the South, and I was working doing riverkeeping in rural western North Carolina, so I've developed a way to kind of talk about water that appeals to everybody. And I'm like, oh wait, I don't really need to do that because it's pretty easy to do. It's the backbone of our economy. It's the backbone of our public health. It's part of our culture. It's part of our identity. So I think things are moving positively in that regard. With regards to our organization's work in Tallahassee, we've been to Tallahassee. We've met with the Secretary of DEP on a number of issues, ranging from BMAPs, Basin Management Action Plans, to resiliency issues, to historic lack of enforcement. And we have now all the waterkeepers throughout the state of Florida, as of about a month and a half ago, have kind of come together and created an entity called Waterkeepers Florida that will better enable us to affect change at the state level.
Thank you, Andy. And I think I agree that we're cautiously optimistic right now with the new administration, but keep a tight eye on them. Your statement about stormwater being the primary source for emerging contaminants. I'm not aware that there's a lot of monitoring on the wastewater side either, so where is that statement coming from?
So that's a good question. So waste, and I can kind of conflate the two. When you ever have stormwater issues, of course, sometimes that leads, when we have wet weather events, that leads to the wastewater overflows. So those issues were conflated there. But beyond the emerging contaminants that we find, like pharmaceutical waste that would come out of wastewater, we also have PFOS and PFOA, and these fluorinated organic compounds that are very concerning to us and to many other folks, that comes from airports. Dr. Steve Murowski at College of Marine Science, I was talking with him, and he's like, we have 3 big airports, and they're a major source of a certain suite of emerging contaminants, and that would be through stormwater runoff coming off of these facilities. It's one example where that would strictly be regulated as stormwater, but yeah.
So we've got students who are running off to classes now, and I want to talk to you further about how Stetson can formally collaborate with you. But before we formally close the end of this program, can you tell the students and others in the audience, if they want to participate in the work of Tampa Bay Waterkeeper, what should they do?
Come check out our website. Follow us on Facebook and follow us on Instagram, on social media. That's where you can learn about the water quality work that we're doing week after week and ways to get involved. We are going to be expanding volunteer opportunities. We have a couple internships that we're going to be announcing pretty soon. Beyond that, we're a grassroots membership-driven organization. If you care about the mission, become a member. We don't we don't take money from polluters, we take money from from the people. So, because we're a membership-driven organization, so if you are so inclined to support our work in that way, become a member and follow us and learn how you can stay involved.
Great. Thank you so much, Andy, for
Thank you
joining
so
us
much.
today. Thanks. I hope you can stick around just to answer a few more questions with folks who